Okay, so moving on, one of the biggest struggles in the region in the more modern context is, how do you deal with the rich countries from the poor countries, right? And just like anywhere else in any other society, including our own, we have our wealthy and we have a middle class which buffers the wealthy between and the poor. In fact, I would argue the middle class is really a purposely created entity to really have like middle management so that the poor don't really get direct access to the rich. They interact more with those in the middle class. But in these regions, there is no middle class for the most part. They're either rich or they're poor. And so there are two different kinds of states that exist in this region, those that produce and those that allocate. And the production states are basically those states where the people or the citizens deal mostly in agricultural arenas, herding, manufacturing. So they're the laborers who labor for the wealthier states or wealthier even in their own countries. And that's where their revenues come from. They come from the actions of their labor. And then the other type are allocation states. And these are states, sometimes we also call them rentier states. And rentier states is Rentier. And it basically means they have like a commodity, like oil, which is the biggest money driver in the region. And the revenue they make from oil is what allows for them to have vast wealth and be able to build on their wealth across their across their countries. And so, with that, though, the governments basically own the means of production as well as the allocation of the resources to the global markets, and that allows for vast wealth to be drawn from them. Uh, there are lots of economic issues that confront the Middle East, certainly because they have a lot of poor population. Economic population growth is an issue because typically poorer countries tend to have rapid population growth. The rise of urbanization, those that are trying to move to the cities, and which is where most of the jobs reside. So you have poor populations moving in, which they obviously call labor migration. People will migrate to wherever they need to, but again, along with that comes a lot of social stigmatization. Social stigmatization, which basically, the plights of the poor and being poor for generations can have tremendous impact on societies, whether it be from crime or just people frustrated with the lifestyle they've had to live. A lot of them join radical groups, a lot of radical Islamic groups to slap back at society for its failing them. Here's an example of the population growth in the region as well as the GDP of some of the per capita of some of the countries. So you can see here in the last 200 years, approximately, Cairo's went from 200,000 to 12 million. Istanbul, which is in Turkey, these are the cities, by the way, the urban population growth. So then Istanbul, which is in Turkey, went from 300,000 to 6 million. Casablanca, which is in Morocco, went from 15,000 to 3 million. And Tehran, which went from 10,000 people, which is in Iran, went from 10,000 to 8 million. So you've had quite a population growth during these periods. And then as far as GDP per capita, you can see some of the poorer countries like Afghanistan, $2,000 per capita. That's the median income of those individuals who live in that country. Iran's was 18,000 approximately. Kuwait was almost 80,000. Lebanon was 18,005, and then Yemen was 2,400. So you can see the poorer countries. And if you look at that, you can see where the rise of more radical sects and radicalization, where those individuals come from, tend to be from those countries that struggle in these areas. Here's an example of, again, we talk about the labor migration. These are people who are peasants who work in the cities to try to make money for themselves, but still carry, the social, cultural aspects of their lives from where they grew up. Then trying to nexus that with modernization can always be a huge problem. Um, of course, the idea of in order to get rich, foreign investments, where it has really failed miserably for the most part, partially because of a lack of understanding of the Middle East and political culture, historical realities. The things that make countries are the things that they struggle with. And so when you try to come in and sell your version of reality to countries who have their own historical, realities, it really does blow up in your face. And this is one of those situations where we see that play out significantly. Um, And then also the fact that they have what's called capital flight, where when those who get wealthy, and don't invest in the poor of their country. So they invest in getting richer, not in investing in the poor. So there's very little trickle down economics to build a middle class, which would help them thrive economically. It's ironic to think that if you build a middle class, they will purchase the goods and services that will help drive your economy. And yet, because they don't, that causes them to fail even further. So the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Of course, some of the other things they deal with, corruption, you have centralized economic controls, meaning centralized by the state governments, and they control all the into access points for wealth and taxation. Also, colonial legacy, the reality of what happened throughout the colonial period with the European influences. The wealth was extracted, but didn't build with wealth within those countries. So again, it further fortifies the poor being poor and the rich being rich. Also, there's some border issues that have not been dealt with, and these just continue on. And then, of course, the big elephant in the room is also the Palestinian issue, which is a huge thing to try and swallow in a short context. But basically, it's a notion of that really, in the more modern context, starts in the early 20th century, where the struggle between whose land is it anyway is the question. And historically, people could go back and say, well, 2,000 years ago, it belonged to the Jews, but here, 2,000 years later, does it still belong to them? And so, what we saw that during out from the beginning of the Common Era up and through to the 19th century, there were many Jews had migrated into Europe and had been living in Europe for hundreds of years, and so their view of the world was very Eurocentric, meaning that it was built around European culture, ideology, education, history, all those aspects that make them what they are. They were built into this context. And so during the time of the late 19th century, the rise of Zionism or Jewish nationalism became very prevalent. And so with that, there were those ideologies that said that they want the idea of returning to your homeland and the homeland belonged to them based on the historical and religious context. And so these nationalists or Zionists rose up very strongly in the late 19th, early 20th century, demanding basically a right to reestablish, if you would, their homeland as a state for them in their homeland. Now, this was driven and certainly had a huge consequence, especially during the colonial period. And I kind of blame the Brits for all this because in 1917, with the Balfour Declaration, basically it was a declaration that said that that Britain would basically work toward establishing a Palestinian state for the Jews. And this is all well and good on some level, but then you have to understand there have been people living in there who thought the territory was theirs for thousands of years. So, or not thousands, but let's say hundreds of years that, for at least almost 1,000 years thought it was theirs. So now you have people who are coming in saying, oh, wait, no, 2,000 years ago was ours, so now we want it back. And so this is where the conflict begins. And then in 1920, with the British mandate, the Palestine was passed, which basically said that the Brits were going to do what they said they were going to do and establish a Palestinian state for the Jews. So at that time, a lot of the European Jews started trying to migrate back to the region. Of course, there were many conflicts with the local people who were there because they were like, well, wait a minute, what are you doing? This is not your home anymore. You've been gone for generations, so what makes you think you belong here, right? Then we get into by the mid 20th century when we get into World War II and post World War II, the issue was set aside during World War II just because of the nature of the war. And then in 1947, the League of Nations passed a vote to partition Palestine into two states. So you would have Israel on one hand, and Palestine would get part of the other part. And this led to, because there was resistance to this, led to the War of Independence, which was in 1948 resulted in the Declaration of Independence by Israel, and the armistice, which ended it, which basically didn't give Israel recognition as a state, but gave them a homeland that they could call their own, even though it wasn't officially declared theirs as of yet. And then the Palestinians during this time, while Israel was celebrating, Palestinians called this time period Nakba, which basically was what they called the catastrophe of the creation of Israel. And they have been resistant to recognizing Israel as a state ever since. Now, since that time, there have been tons of conflicts, but a couple I will point out particularly that really were pivotal. One was the 1967 war. It was called the Six-Day War between Egypt and Israel. But the result was taking over more territory from the Palestinians that had been given to them during the 1947 agreement. And then in 1973, the Yom Kippur War, that was also where the Palestinians lost more territory. And so those are what we call the occupied territories now. And it's unfortunate Gaza Strip, Sinai, some of those areas that are historically for prior to 1967 had resulted were the homes of Palestinians that they had lost during the wars that they want back. But Israel's like, no, we're not giving this stuff back. Even though they've been trying to resolve that ever since, it has yet to occur. In 1993, they had and so 1993 they had the Oslo Accords that were brought forth, which resulted in the Zionists rising up and assassinating Yitzhak Rabin, who was the prime minister of Israel. Also in 1979, President Sadat of Egypt tried to broker a peace. He was assassinated for trying to brokering a peace. So it's been basically, for lack of a better word, a dog with fleas ever since, and with no resolution in sight to this day. Yeah, there's other political peripheral stuff going on in the region that creates a problem. The rise of Al Qaeda, radical terrorism, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the Arab Spring, which is like Arab independence that happened in 2010, civil wars, the rise of ISIS, the Islamic State, who were doing a lot of beheadings, and it's again more radical terrorism. A lot of times they use it, even though the justification is Islam. Rarely is Islam the real reason why they're doing it. It's usually for their own political gain or recognition. But people suffer as a result of those actions. Um, and then the reality of political Islam, like Islam in modern times and how it's integrated into society in the modern period, and how it's rooted in the economies and basically how they go about trying to uh, branch Islam into every aspect of life, which based on the Quran it's supposed to anyway. But in most political structures, there's a separation of what we call church and state, but not in Islam. Okay. And so, therefore, like I say, it's a very diverse region. It's got significant issues to deal with, no vibrant middle class, and the various crises and events that have occurred. There seem to be no end in sight at this point because of leaders that are there. Whenever you find someone who wants to broker a peace, the historical baggage or radical groups within those entities tend to kill leaders who don't agree with them or support their causes. Or if you look too weak, they will try to kill you. So, in order for the U.S. to better assist, it will require a better understanding and sensitivity to the historical realities of the Middle East and the people who reside there. And I will stop there at chapter 11, and we have one more chapter to go. And you guys have a great day. By the way, this is a two-part lecture, so you'll see two parts of this. Okay, thanks.